Hello everyone and welcome to Principles of Biology. Today we're going to cover the introduction to biology, exploring life. So this is really going to be just a very introductory lecture into the world of biology. So what are we going to be talking about today? We are going to cover what is biology. I think a lot of people kind of have an understanding of what biology is, but we'll give you the real definition of biology and what are some good reasons to study biology. Why should we care about biology? And then we're going to get into a little bit about how life is organized, the organization of life, and we're going to dive in a little bit into cells and organisms. And then we're just going to kind of get an introduction into evolution. Of course, we're going to cover all of these topics in a lot more detail throughout the semester. And then what is the process of science? How do we study biology and other sciences of the world? And just a little bit about diversity. And again, we're going to really dive into this a little bit more throughout the semester. All right, you guys, so what is biology, right? I posed that question earlier, so maybe you have a definition you're kind of thinking about in your head, and you're probably right, right? So it's really the study of life. So it's a science that studies life. But then you got to ask yourself, well, what is life, right? What does it mean to be alive? Is a virus considered alive? So think about that for a little bit and we'll come back to that. So kind of think about it. Is a virus alive? And maybe what is the definition of life? And we're going to answer that in a little bit. So now, why do we care about biology, right? Why should we study biology? Well, there's a lot of cool reasons. So really there's a lot of social and ethical issues in the world that really has to do with science and biology, right? So maybe you've seen some of these glowing phosphorescent animals. So this kitten has a gene that that's actually found in jellyfish. And so they glow under black light. You've seen them probably in fish as well at the pet store. So these are kind of these ethical and maybe even social issues that come up, and maybe you can be more informed about those because you know where to find, literature and what is biology, how do we study biology. We can learn about our body, right? So a lot of you guys have either taken or will take human anatomy. So, anatomy is all about biology, right? We are a living thing. So how does the body function? How do we work, right? That's all biology. There's a lot of career opportunities in biology, right? So there's a whole scientific world out there, and there are some wonderful jobs available for people with degrees in the sciences, as well as just really appreciating the world around you a little bit better, right? So here's a bee pollinating a flower. So really you can just take your time and appreciate life, and especially nowadays that everybody's inside, it's good to get out and kind of view the world, right? So when we talk about life, what are some common properties that all forms of life share? So this is really important, okay? So one is order. So there is a complex organization that is found in kind of all levels of life. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit about that kind of organization and structure. We respond to the environment, right? So animals, things that are alive, plants, respond to some sort of outside stimulus, right? So just like the Venus flytrap, it's responding to an external environment cue from that fly, and it responds, right? So all of us do that. Reproduction, right? Organisms make more of their own kind. So that's really the purpose of most life, is to pass on the genetic information into generations to come, okay? And evolutionary adaptation. right? Traits that are more adaptive, that help that animal survive in its environment, that animal is going to have a higher reproductive success rate. So go on to reproduce and send those traits into the next generation. Just like the giraffe here, right? How did that giraffe get such a long neck, right? It seems weird, but in their environment, that's the best adaptive strategy. So what are some more common properties that all forms of life share, right? So growth and development. We all change as individuals, right? We grow. We start out small and young, and we grow and we change throughout our lifespan. Regulation and homeostasis. So we want to keep our internal environment consistent and constant. So if you think of, animals like a polar bear that live in very extreme environments, they have to maintain their body temperature and homeostasis to make sure all of their internal organs are functioning correctly, right? So they have adaptations set into place so that they can regulate their environment and survive, their internal environment. Energy processing. We all need energy, right? So we all need energy to survive. So we have to consume that energy. Plants use sun energy, and we'll talk about how we process this energy, right? And you think about hummingbirds, and they have such high metabolisms that they're drinking, pure sugar water just to keep that energy level enough so that they can survive. So now we're going to talk about the organization of life. So we're going to start big and we're going to get smaller. So we start with the biosphere, right? So that's really the world that we live in, right? The Earth. And then within that biosphere, we're going to have ecosystems, okay, for an example. So we're going to take an example and we're going to work through it. So take Florida, for example, and the Everglades. So the Everglades is a very specific type of ecosystem, and we'll talk more about different types of ecosystems later in the course. So within that ecosystem, in the Everglades, we have a community. So the community is going to be all those organisms within that Everglade ecosystem or a wetlands, okay? And then within that community, you're going to have a population. So you're going to have all the organisms in the community, and then you take just one population of an organism, say the alligators, right? So that's going to be all alligators living in the wetlands, okay? And then you might take an organism or an individual in that population. So the American alligator, so just one individual organism. So now we're going to take that organism, that one individual, and we can look at an organ system within that individual. So there are many organ systems, but let's just pick one. So let's say the nervous system, right? So that's the brain, spinal cord, and nerves, okay? And then we're going to dive in and pick just one organ of that organ system. So let's say the brain, right? And then within the brain, you have nervous tissue making up that brain. Now, what's in that nervous tissue? Well, you have nerve cells, right? You have other types of cells as well, but you have neurons or nerve cells. So then if you take that nerve cell and look inside the cell, you're going to have organelles within the cell, okay? Kind of think of like the organs of the body. Well, there's going to be organs or organelles in the cell itself. So let's pick one of the organelles. Let's say the nucleus, okay? And we're going to talk a lot about those organelles. And we look in the nucleus, and what is that made up of? It's made up of DNA. And you look at DNA, and you get that smallest unit, the atom, okay? So I want you to be able to know all of these organization levels and the definitions, okay, from biosphere to atom. So now let's talk a little bit more about cells. Cells are the smallest unit of life. So remember we asked that question a little while back. What is life, right? What makes something alive? Is a virus considered alive? Okay. Well, cells are the lowest level of structure that can perform all the activities required for life. Okay, and this is why viruses are not considered alive, because they're not made up of cells. They're not a cell. They're just a fragment. Okay, so that's why viruses have to invade cells so that they take over all those activities of the cell to keep living. Okay, to be considered alive. So they have to take over and hijack a cell to be able to function. Okay, so cells are the smallest unit of life. I want you guys to know that for sure. So let's take a look at some cells. So there are two types of cells in the living world, and those are prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. So what does prokaryotic and eukaryotic mean? So prokaryotic means before a nucleus. So it doesn't have a true nucleus. And they're unicellular. Okay. Now eukaryotic cells mean that it has a true nucleus. And these guys can be unicellular or multicellular. And the thing is they have a membrane-bound nucleus and other organelles. So that means that it's all those organs in the cell, little organelles, have a membrane. They have like a saran wrap, a wrapping around them. That's a membrane, okay? So now that we know that cells are the smallest unit of life, we can put cells together to produce other living organisms. So how do these organisms interact with their environment? We said that organisms are always going to require energy, right? So how do we utilize energy in the environment? So this is a great image about this energy flow throughout the world, right? So we know that the sun produces a lot of energy, right? So how could we harness that energy from the sun? Well, plants are the things that are able to harness that energy from the sun. We are not able to do that. So these guys, these plants are considered producers, okay? Because they actually use the sun energy, undergo photosynthesis, and they're able to produce energy, okay? So the leaves of the plants are able to take up CO2 from the air and water and all the nutrients in the soil and undergo photosynthesis, okay? So they are amazing. So we call that group of organisms producers, anything that can use the sun as energy. Now what happens is us as animals, we are consumers. So where do we get our energy? We have to consume our energy, right? So we eat plants or other animals to produce our energy. Okay, so the producers are the ones getting the energy from the sun. We then eat them or other animals to get our energy. And there's actually a third group of organisms called decomposers. So these guys are really cool because they're actually able to break down wastes in the environment for their energy. Okay, so they break down, dead things and old wood, old plants, old animals, just like fungus or worms, and they recycle all those waste products because they use them as energy. Okay, so very cool. There's kind of this energy flow throughout the environment, but definitely know our different types of organisms in the energy world, right? We've got our producers, we've got our consumers, and our decomposers. So now just pause the video for a second and kind of think about this idea of producers and consumers and what are some more examples of them. Okay, so just pause the video and write them down. So hopefully you were able to come up with some good examples of producers and consumers. So we said kind of plants and animals, right? But pick, maybe a tree as a plant, and a horse as an animal. Those are my two, right? So now we're going to get a little introduction into the core theme of biology, which is evolution. And a lot of people know, Darwin is the father of evolution. So we'll discover a little bit more about why that is throughout the course. But what does evolution explain? Well, it explains the unity and diversity of life. What does that mean? Well, it means that there are similarities, but there's also differences between all of the different species of the world from early on until now. So not everyone is the same, but you see similarities between all life. Okay, so that's why evolution can explain why we see these similarities and the differences at the same time. And this whole theory of evolution was really popularized after Charles Darwin published his book, The Origin of the Species, way back in 1859. So he really is who became popular, and the father of evolution. But we'll find out in a minute that another scientist actually came up with the same theory, but nobody knows about him. So even though Charles Darwin was able to propose this mechanism of evolution, how does evolution work? And that theory is called natural selection. Well, he wasn't the only one to come up with natural selection. There's another scientist called Alfred Russel Wallace who also proposed the same mechanism at the same time that Charles Darwin did. And this is really kind of eye-opening. I didn't even know this either. But because Darwin produced that novel, that's what made him famous and has stuck through time. Okay. So what is natural selection then? What is this mechanism that they both discovered around the same time? Well, we know that there is variation in populations, right? Not everybody is the same, right? Even brother and sister, siblings don't look the same. There's variation, genetic variation. There's overproduction, meaning that reproduction drive is working really well, right? You're going to overproduce a species. And then there's going to be this unequal reproductive success, which means that some individuals are going to be able to reproduce and some are not, right? And so that means that there's going to be the favorable traits of those individuals that were able to reproduce over time. So they are going to pass on that genetic information, whereas the ones that weren't able to reproduce, they won't, right? So their genetic information dies out. And that's where the adaptation comes into play. So if we look back at our giraffe example, right, we may have variation of neck length, right? And we're going to overproduce all these different variations, but some are going to be more successful than others. So the ones that are able to reach the leaves, the longer necks, are going to be more successful, therefore lead to more reproduction. Therefore, their genetic information will pass on to the next generations over time. So let's dive a little deeper into natural selection. So there are these three principles that operate in nature. The first one is that the characteristics of an organism are inherited or passed down from the parent to the offspring, right? So that genetic information was passed down from the parent. There's always going to be more offspring produced than can survive. There's that overproduction, which means that resources for survival are going to be limited. So they're going to have to fight over those resources, whether that's food, water, living space, habitat, right? There's going to be some fight over the resources. Offspring are going to vary, right? So they're not going to look exactly the same. So there's going to be that variation again in those inherited traits, okay? And a lot of people kind of have a misnomer of natural selection. They think it's the survival of the fittest. But what does the fittest actually mean? And there's a great quote from Charles Darwin. It is not the strongest of the species that survive, nor the most intelligent, but the one most responsive to change. So if the environment changes, and you adapt to that environment and you have some sort of characteristic that allows you to operate well in that habitat, you will survive. And then you will pass down that trait or that characteristic to your offspring. And over time, that population will change, right? So now let's look at an example of natural selection. Right, so we know that a population of individuals has variation, and this variation is due to genetic mutation. Okay, so we'll talk about mutations in a little bit, but essentially that creates the variation in a population. Now, we have elimination of individuals with the least adaptive traits. So that means they die off or have less offspring. So if we look at our example over here, so we have these blackbirds that enjoy eating the green beetles, right? So they're going to ignore these orange beetles. So because these orange beetles are not being eaten and they have a more adaptive trait, then they are going to increase the frequency of their adaptive trait. Okay, so generations later, they're going to be the ones surviving and breeding and having more offspring. And so then they are going to be increasing in that population. And the green ones are going to be the ones that are going to be dying off or having less offspring. And this is going to be the same until the environment changes again. So these orange guys are going to win out over the green ones until maybe another bird comes in and then they like the orange beetles, okay? And then that just throws it off all over again, okay? So now we have a really good example of natural selection in these rock pocket mice, okay? And I have the video on Canvas, okay? So the rock pocket mice video is on Canvas and I want you guys to look over it. And I want you guys to keep these questions in mind because this is going to be your write-up that's going to be due at the end of the week. You're going to answer these questions for me, okay? So when you're watching the video, ask yourself, how does this video show the process of natural selection? So now that you know a little bit more about natural selection, how is that being shown in the video? What are mutations? So they're going to have a great explanation of what mutations are, okay? What is natural selection? Is it a random process, right? And explain using the definition. So is it random or is it a thing that happens predictably? Okay. And then last but not least, how does this study follow the scientific method? Okay. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the scientific method later in this lecture. Okay. So keep these questions in mind as you watch the video, maybe jot them down, right? And watch the video on Canvas. And then you guys are going to do a write-up at the end of the week. So speaking of the scientific method, we're going to talk a little bit more about the process of science. And the word science comes from the Latin word scientia, meaning knowledge. So science is really a way of learning about the natural world using observation and logical reasoning, right? So we observe the world, and then we're going to come up with some logical explanations for why things are happening the way they are. And the fields of science that are related to the physical world and its phenomenon are considered natural sciences. Okay, and we can split natural sciences into life sciences and physical sciences. Now, life sciences, as the name suggests, is going to study living things, whereas the physical sciences are going to study non-living things or non-living matter. Okay, and we learn about the whole natural world by using the scientific method. So now we said that scientists observe the natural world and use logical thinking. So there are two methods of logical thinking or logical reasoning. And the first one is inductive reasoning. And this is a descriptive or discovery-based science. So what it does is it really uses observations to arrive at a general conclusion. Okay, and theories can really arise from this type of reasoning. For example, years and years of findings from biologists, they discovered that all organisms are made of cells. So they looked at all organisms over years and years and years, and they said, well, they're all made up of cells, okay? And therefore, they create the cell theory, that a cell is a basic unit of life, okay? Now, the second type of method is deductive reasoning, and this is really a hypothesis-based science. So it uses kind of a general principle or law of science to predict or forecast certain results. And this is really the basis of scientific method, okay? So if we say our hypothesis is that all organisms are made of cells, well, and humans are organisms, right? So then all humans are made of cells, okay? So you use that hypothesis that's already in place or some sort of general principle or law to then predict your result, okay? So these are the two big types of kind of scientific inquiry, okay? And I want you to know the difference and the definitions of these two, okay? So now here's a better way of thinking about inductive versus deductive reasoning. Okay, so inductive, you're going to start at the observation level. Okay, so many observations, and then you're going to find a pattern within that observation with all those many observations. And therefore, you may be able to come up with a hypothesis, okay, about those patterns, and then you then come into a theory. Okay, so that's inductive reasoning. But the reverse is true for deductive reasoning. You take that kind of accepted theory or law, and then you say, okay, we're going to create a hypothesis from that. Just like we said, if all organisms are made up of cells and humans are organisms, then humans must be made up of cells. Then you observe, right? So you observe to see if you can prove your hypothesis correct. And then you get your confirmation or not, right? So you may not prove your hypothesis. So these are the two ways that we study science, okay? So then hopefully using those types of reasoning, you come up with these scientific theories. And a lot of people think the scientific theories are the law, right? They must be true because they're a theory. Or they're just willy-nilly and it's just a guess, right? One of the two extremes are usually kind of thought up of when people think about scientific theory who don't understand. And so really theories can be disproven or changed if any of these observations contradict them. So theories are not set in stone, but they are based on a really extensive amount of empirical evidence. And empirical evidence is based on observation and experimentation, right? So we're proving and reproving these theories over and over again, okay? But they tend to be very broad and very general, just like our cell theory example, right? So if all living things are made up of cells, that's very broad, right? but it is supported by a large growing body of evidence. Okay, so scientific theories are not written in stone. They can be disproven or modified, but they are very, very strong and have a lot of evidence to support them. So scientists are really the ones that are doing this process of science, right? They're the ones out there making the observations, forming and testing their hypotheses. That's what it means to be a scientist, right? You're testing the natural world. So observation is really essential for understanding science, right? Observations are key. And they can be made either directly or indirectly. Okay, so you can observe it directly, or you can look at other things and can deduce those observations from them. Okay, and so how do we describe the natural structures and processes accurately? So when you're making these observations, how are you describing them, right? So you have some sort of data, right? And qualitative data is often what you are gathering as observations. Okay, so they might be notes in a book, right? So such as an example of Jane Goodall, and she went out and observed chimpanzees' behavior, and she was able to take lots and lots of notes when she was observing their behavior. And then you have quantitative data. And this can really be presented in the form of numbers and graphs. So this is where you might find patterns in your observations, right? So qualitative data, think those are your notes, right? Just your pure observations. And then quantitative data is going to be some sort of number, okay? It's going to give some sort of quantity to it. Okay, so that's the difference between qualitative and quantitative data. So hopefully, just to review the scientific method, and hopefully you've seen this before, in another science class, really, how do we use the scientific method, right? So first you're going to ask a question. Okay, you've been observing, you have a question, you see a pattern, so you ask that question. Now you're going to do that research, right? You're going to do that observation. And now you're going to construct a hypothesis. Just like we said, okay, our hypothesis is going to be that humans are made up of cells. Because we did the background research, we knew the theory, the cell theory, right, that all organisms are made up of cells. We did our research, now we're going to say, humans are made up of cells. So now we're going to test that hypothesis, right? So you're going to test it with some sort of experiment. You're going to analyze the data, right? Does this support my hypothesis or not? Okay, so if it does, then you have supported data for your hypothesis. But if it's false or maybe partially true, you might have to come back and change your hypothesis. Okay, that's definitely for partially true. You might have to tweak it just a little bit. Okay, so that's the scientific method, and hopefully that's a little bit of a review. So now we're going to change gears a little bit and talk about the diversity of life. Remember we said when we were talking about evolution and the theory of natural selection, we said that there's going to be variation in a population and there's going to be diversity on a broader scale in the world. But what is genetic variation? Well, it's going to be small changes in the organism's DNA. Okay, so your DNA is not going to be identical to another's DNA. There's going to be some small changes, some small mutations that we talked about earlier. And when you look at the DNA, you're really looking at genes. And what are genes? Well, they're a unit of inheritance passed on from one generation to the next. Okay, so you might, you've always heard that saying, oh, you've got good genes from your dad, or sure have those genes from mom, so it's passed on from one generation to the next. and that's a unit of inheritance. Okay, and what these genes do is they code for proteins. And what proteins do is they control the activities of your cells. Okay, so they can completely change the outcome of these cells and what they do. Okay, and we'll talk a lot more about genes and proteins and all of this, but just to get a general idea of why we have genetic variation and diversity. So why do we care about diversity? Okay, why do we use it? How do we use it? Well, we can compare genes across species. Okay, again, we just said that one individual is very different from another individual, so you can even compare across different species. And maybe you can even see if there are evolutionary relationships between species and organisms. We can also study genetic disorders and diseases and say, hey, this disorder is caused by this gene, right? There's a lot of talk nowadays about breast cancer being linked to one gene, and now you can even test for that gene. If you have breast cancer in your family, they can test and see if you have that gene for that disease, right? So lots of studying being done on genetic disorders. So diversity can really be arranged into 3 different groups. So these groups are called domains. And so we're really going to start big and we're going to work our way smaller. So the whole diversity of life can really only be categorized into 3 domains. That's crazy. So our 3 domains are bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Okay, so bacteria is pretty straightforward. We kind of know what bacteria are, okay? And archaea is something that we may not have seen before, and these guys are very strange. They're a lot like bacteria, but they're not the same, so they have their own domain. Now, eukarya is really what you guys probably think of as life, right? So all plants, all animals, fungi, all of that you see in your everyday life is going to be under eukarya. Now, we've identified 1.8 million species, okay? But that is a fraction of what we think is actually out there, right? So we've estimated about 10 to 100 million species. So we haven't even scratched the surface. Think about that for a minute, right? And most of them are probably in these categories that we just don't even know about, right? Now we can further group all of these guys into kingdoms, phylums, all of that, and we'll get more into that when we talk about the diversity of life later in the course. And then we can cluster these groups into broader categories like birds and insects. So we start to break everything down into smaller and smaller groups, okay? So let's look at a little tree of diversity. Okay, so this is called a phylogeny tree, and we're going to become more familiar with this type of organization later in the course. But if we take our 3 domains, we have our bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. And if we look at the cells that are within those domains, these 2, bacteria and archaea, are prokaryotic unicellular organisms. Okay, so we talked about what a prokaryotic organism is. And then in eukarya, these guys are eukaryotic cells, which can either be uni or multicellular. And then we said within eukarya, we've got a couple kingdoms. So these guys are domains, our 3 domains. And then we have our 3 kingdoms, which are plants. Okay, we said those guys are our producers, our photosynthesizers. We have fungi, which absorb, so they're decomposers. And then we have animals, which are going to be those consumers that ingest the food, right? And then we have this group that's kind of doesn't really fit. And protists are very strange because it depends. Okay. They can sometimes do photosynthesis, they can sometimes absorb, and they can sometimes ingest. So they kind of fit in all three kingdoms. So they're very strange, and we'll talk a little bit more about these guys. So now let's come back a little bit to evolution and natural selection. And how do we experience kind of evolution in our everyday life, right? So we can see evolution and it is connected even if you don't think about it in our everyday life. And the thing is that normally we think of evolution as being part of nature, right? So nature is going to evolve these organisms over time. Well, humans can actually be huge agents of evolution. We can create evolution over time. You might think that sounds crazy, but let's take a look. So we have natural selection, which we've been talking about, the product of evolution and natural selection. This is really the environment selecting for those adaptive traits. Which traits are going to allow you to survive in your environment? That is natural selection, and that is the environment. But let's look at artificial selection. We are going to select desirable traits. Now, I don't know who in the world thinks that that is really some traits to be selected for, but somebody did, right? So this is a product of selective breeding. That's how we get the different dogs, domesticated animals in our life, because somebody said, that looks cute and I want more of them, right? So this is not a product of the environment, it's a product of people, right? So there's a difference between these two, but the outcome is the same, that whether it's the environment or the humans that have created change over time and created evolution, right? So something to think about and kind of interesting. You'll never look at dogs the same way. So now that we know that humans can direct evolution, how do they affect the environment as well? So we talked about selective breeding, but how can they affect the environment? Well, there's been a lot of habitat loss and climate change due to humans, right? Human interaction with their environment. And this can definitely drive evolution in the species, right? So now the species that live in these environments are going to have to adapt to their new environment due to the habitat loss and climate change. We also see a lot of antibiotic and pesticide resistance, right? So now that we use antibiotics, we use pesticides, so our bacteria and our pests are now evolving, and the ones that survive the antibiotic and the pesticide are going to breed, and they are the ones that are going to pass on that resistance genetic material, okay? And if you want to know more about this, which is a really interesting topic, is that the humans being the world's greatest evolutionary force and how we have driven evolution over time. It's a very fascinating article, and I have posted it on Canvas for you if you are interested in reading it. It's just for fun, right? So just the stuff on the slides and our lectures is what you guys will be tested on. But if you are interested and want to read more about it, you are welcome to. So this is just a little bit more just for your edification about antibiotic resistance and just something to be aware of. There's really a war going on between bacteria and antibiotics, right? So how does this resistance develop and spread? So we feed a lot of our livestock animals antibiotics. helps the growth rate, it helps to prevent disease, but then we also fertilize all of our plants with the manure coming from those animals that have been fed antibiotics. So now we have plants that are now exposed to those antibiotics, and then we are consuming those plants and those livestock with the antibiotic resistance. And so then any sort of bacteria in our body is going to develop a resistance against those antibiotics. So it's just something to be aware of, cognizant of, because there really is an interesting theory that, the bacteria are going to win out and that we can't develop new antibiotics fast enough to counteract these antibiotic resistant bacteria. So you've heard of MRSA and all of that. So it's happening right now, and it's kind of scary to think about. But again, this is, the world of science and biology can open your eyes to maybe why this is happening and make you more educated, to maybe, pick the chicken at the store that says raised without antibiotics, right? So just something to consider and food for thought, right? Well, until next time, I will see you guys later.